So, Camilla was reportedly left completely stunned after a dramatic royal council decision allegedly stripped away one of the most important parts of her position. And the name that suddenly appeared at the center of the new arrangement was Catherine. But here's where this story gets interesting, because according to the dramatic account we're examining, this wasn't simply a disagreement between two senior royals. It was supposedly the result of months of tension, disputed decisions, changing instructions, and a growing concern inside the palace that two different centers of influence were beginning to emerge. And then came the moment nobody expected. Camilla was allegedly informed that her authority was being transferred to Catherine, and the reaction was described as immediate. But there's one detail in this entire story that changes everything. The council's decision may have been dramatic, but the real question is why the council supposedly felt it had to intervene in the first place. Because if the allegations are true, this wasn't about popularity. It wasn't about who received louder applause. And it wasn't even really about Catherine. It was about control. So before we get into the confrontation that allegedly pushed this situation over the edge, make sure you stay with me, because the deeper you go into this story, the less it looks like a simple royal family dispute. And the first clue appeared long before Camilla was supposedly stripped of her authority. For months, there had allegedly been growing tension over the way instructions moved through the royal household. Normally, a decision made at the top would travel through a clearly defined chain of communication before reaching staff responsible for carrying it out. But according to the account we're examining, several instructions were allegedly changed, delayed, or redirected before they reached their intended destination. And that's where Catherine's name enters the story, because some of the disputed instructions reportedly involved events where Catherine's position was supposed to be clearly defined. On paper, these might sound like small ceremonial details. Who stands where? Who receives guests? Which office receives a briefing? Which household handles an invitation? But inside an institution built around hierarchy, those details aren't always small. They can communicate power, they can communicate rank, and they can reveal who actually controls the machinery behind the scenes. That is why one alleged incident became so important. A ceremonial arrangement had reportedly been approved that placed Catherine in a prominent position. But by the time the instruction allegedly reached staff, Catherine's role had changed. Her name was reportedly removed, and another household was given priority. At first, this could have been dismissed as a scheduling mistake, a misunderstanding, an administrative error. But according to the dramatic narrative, it wasn't an isolated incident. There were allegedly multiple examples. And that is when people inside the palace supposedly started paying attention. Because one mistake is a mistake, a pattern is something else. And once the pattern became impossible to ignore, the question reportedly reached Charles. What exactly was happening to his instructions after they left his office? That's the question that allegedly changed everything. Because if a monarch approves an instruction and someone else quietly changes it before staff receive it, the issue isn't merely personal. It becomes institutional, and that distinction is critical. Imagine being a junior member of staff. You receive one instruction from the king's office. Then you're told by another senior office to do something completely different. Who do you obey? And what happens if choosing the wrong person costs you your position? According to the account we're examining, Some staff members were allegedly becoming increasingly uncomfortable with exactly that situation. One alleged incident involved a briefing intended for Catherine. Because of its urgency, the briefing was reportedly sent directly to her office instead of moving through the normal chain. Shortly afterward, the employee involved was allegedly removed from their position. Now, whether every detail of that account can be independently established is another question. But narratively, this is where the story becomes much bigger than Catherine versus Camilla. Because suddenly, the issue is no longer about two women occupying different places inside the royal hierarchy. It's about whether palace employees felt safe following instructions that originated from the wrong office. And that distinction supposedly caught William's attention. William was already being positioned as the future of the monarchy. Catherine was increasingly viewed as one of the institution's most recognizable figures, and Charles was gradually moving toward a more measured schedule, which meant the center of gravity was naturally shifting forward toward William and Catherine. And that shift may have created a problem for Camilla, because popularity inside the royal family isn't just about applause. It affects perception. It affects access. It affects the public's emotional relationship with the institution. And according to the story, Camilla allegedly began to realize that the monarchy was moving into its next chapter, a chapter in which Catherine's influence would only become greater. That realization reportedly became especially difficult after a public appearance where Catherine received an overwhelmingly enthusiastic response. The crowd reportedly erupted when Catherine appeared. Phones went into the air. People shouted her name. The atmosphere changed instantly. And Camilla allegedly noticed. That moment supposedly stayed with her, because it represented something deeper than a single crowd reaction. Catherine wasn't simply popular. She represented continuity. She represented the future. And William represented the next reign. For someone worried about losing influence, that combination could be intimidating. But here's where the story allegedly took a much more serious turn. Instead of accepting the changing balance, Camilla was accused of trying to protect her position, and the alleged confrontation with William reportedly became unavoidable. William supposedly questioned why an instruction approved by Charles had been changed. And according to the dramatic account, Camilla's response was essentially that Catherine needed to understand the difference between popularity and rank. That line matters because it reveals the supposed mindset behind the entire conflict. Popularity could be temporary. Rank was institutional. Camilla held an important position. Catherine's popularity didn't automatically mean she controlled the palace. But there was one problem. The disputed instructions had allegedly come from Charles himself, and if Charles had already made the decision, changing it wasn't simply a question of rank, it was a challenge to authority. That's when the conflict reportedly moved behind closed doors. Charles allegedly summoned Camilla. William remained nearby, and what followed was described as an extremely tense confrontation. Voices reportedly rose. The disagreement became personal, and eventually, according to the story, Charles made a decision that Camilla wasn't expecting. He would take the matter to the royal council. That was the moment this supposedly stopped being a private family argument. Because once a dispute enters a formal institutional process, the consequences become much harder to control. Camilla could no longer simply explain the situation privately. William couldn't simply negotiate with her, and Catherine couldn't quietly stay outside the conflict forever. The council would have to examine the allegations, the disputed instructions, the household structure, the authority attached to Camilla's position, and most importantly, whether those powers were being used in a way that supposedly undermined the king's own decisions. According to the dramatic account, the council reviewed a collection of documents. Some allegedly showed conflicting instructions. Others supposedly demonstrated that important information had been delayed. And then came the detail that allegedly changed Charles's position completely. A briefing intended for Catherine had reportedly been held back. The information was connected to a major ceremonial event. If Catherine had entered that event without the necessary briefing, the consequences could have been embarrassing, not only for her, but potentially for the entire institution. And that was supposedly the moment Charles realized the problem had gone too far. The council's recommendation was allegedly prepared. The authority attached to Camilla's position was placed under review. And then came the most dramatic part. Camilla was reportedly given a choice. She could surrender some of her authority voluntarily. The palace could present the move as a graceful adjustment. Her dignity could be protected. Her public reputation could be preserved. And the transition could happen quietly. But according to the story, Camilla refused. She allegedly believed that accepting the arrangement would mean admitting defeat, that she had fought for her place beside Charles for too long to simply step away when Catherine's influence began rising. And that refusal supposedly sealed the outcome. Because once the voluntary option disappeared, the council allegedly moved toward the formal transfer. And this is where Catherine enters the story in a completely different way. Catherine reportedly didn't ask for the position. She didn't campaign for it. She wasn't sitting in the council chamber demanding that Camilla be removed. In fact, according to the account, she was deliberately kept away from the decision. That may have been politically important, because if Catherine had been present, critics could easily have accused her of orchestrating the entire outcome. Instead, she allegedly learned about the transfer after the decision had already been made, and her reaction was supposedly not celebration. It was shock. Catherine reportedly looked at the document and struggled to accept what she was reading, because there is a major difference between gaining power and being handed responsibility created by someone else's downfall. And Catherine understood that. She allegedly told William that she never wanted to take anything from Camilla. William reportedly understood, but he also knew something Catherine didn't. If she rejected the transfer, the entire conflict could begin again. The council had made its decision. Someone had to assume responsibility, and Catherine was the obvious choice, not because she demanded it, but because the institution needed continuity. That distinction is incredibly important. Catherine wasn't supposedly being rewarded. She was being positioned as a stabilizing figure, and that is exactly why her next move reportedly shocked people. She accepted. But she refused to celebrate. No victory speech, no public humiliation, no triumphant appearance. Instead, Catherine allegedly chose restraint. She reportedly removed a ceremonial piece before appearing publicly and made it clear through her statement that the transition was about duty, not revenge. Her message supposedly acknowledged Camilla's years of service. It emphasized stability, respect, continuity. And that was smart. because Catherine understood something many people watching from outside might miss. The moment she appeared to enjoy Camilla's downfall, the entire narrative would change. Instead of becoming the responsible future of the monarchy, she would look like someone who benefited from an internal power struggle. So she did the opposite. She stayed calm. And that calmness reportedly made the contrast with Camilla even more dramatic. Because while Catherine was attempting to avoid looking victorious, Camilla was allegedly dealing with the most humiliating part of the transition. Not the announcement, not the council decision, not even the headlines. The real humiliation supposedly came when the people around her stopped taking instructions directly from her. Imagine calling someone who has worked beside you for years. You give them a routine instruction, and they pause. Then they tell you they no longer report to you. That, according to the story, was the moment Camilla finally understood what had happened. The power wasn't simply being reduced on paper, it was gone in practice. Her staff reportedly had new reporting lines. Her requests had to move through Catherine's household. Her influence over internal decisions had been restricted, and the structure that once surrounded her was being reorganized. That's when the emotional consequences reportedly became impossible to hide. And Catherine agreed. This was perhaps the most important conversation in the entire story, because there were no cameras, no ceremony, no council members, just the two women at the center of the controversy. Camilla allegedly asked Catherine one question. Did you know? Did you know the council was going to do this? Catherine reportedly said no. She hadn't requested Camilla's removal. She hadn't secretly organized the decision. She hadn't known the final outcome was coming. And according to the account, that answer changed Camilla's attitude, because suddenly the woman she may have viewed as the architect of her downfall was telling her that she never wanted the position in the first place. And then Camilla allegedly admitted something much more personal. Fear. She was afraid of Catherine's popularity, afraid of William's growing authority, afraid of Charles reducing his workload, afraid that the institution she had spent years fighting to belong to was gradually moving beyond her. And that's the psychological core of this entire story. Sometimes people don't fight because they are confident. They fight because they are terrified of becoming irrelevant. The more they feel their position slipping, the harder they try to control the environment around them. And eventually, the attempt to preserve power can become the very thing that destroys it. That is allegedly what happened here. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly faced her own dilemma. She could reject the new authority. She could say she didn't want it. She could attempt to protect Camilla from the humiliation. But doing that could reopen the entire institutional conflict. William reportedly warned her against refusing. The monarchy needed stability. And so Catherine accepted. But she allegedly made one thing very clear. She wasn't going to use the position to erase Camilla. She would use it to stabilize the institution. That distinction may be the biggest reason Catherine supposedly emerged from the controversy stronger than before. Because while the public debate focused on who won and who lost, Catherine's strategy was apparently much quieter. She didn't need to attack Camilla. She didn't need to explain every allegation. She didn't need to celebrate. The transfer itself had already changed the balance. And then came Charles. According to the dramatic account, the king was caught in the middle. He had allegedly allowed the council process to move forward. He had supposedly accepted that Camilla's authority had to change, but emotionally, this was still his wife. And that's where the story becomes less about politics and more about a marriage under pressure. Charles reportedly visited Camilla privately after the decision. The atmosphere was completely different from the public ceremonies people usually associate with royalty. There was no applause, no photographers, no carefully choreographed smiles. Just two people confronting the consequences of a decision that couldn't easily be undone. Charles allegedly told Camilla that he still loved her, but love couldn't solve the institutional problem because a monarch can forgive a spouse privately. What a monarch cannot easily do is allow personal loyalty to override the structure of the institution. And according to the story, Camilla finally understood that. She reportedly admitted that fear had influenced her decisions. Fear of Catherine, fear of William, fear of losing relevance, fear that the future monarchy wouldn't have a place for her, and Charles supposedly refused to reverse the council's decision. That distinction is crucial. He wasn't allegedly ending the marriage. He wasn't publicly humiliating his wife. He was separating personal loyalty from institutional authority. Camilla could remain his wife. She could remain part of his personal life. But the political and administrative power attached to her role was supposedly finished. And that brings us back to Catherine. Because the woman who supposedly never asked for this responsibility now had to carry it. The palace allegedly issued a carefully worded announcement. It avoided the most explosive allegations. There was no public discussion of internal disputes, no detailed explanation of the staff changes, no dramatic accusation against Camilla, just a formal transition. But behind that calm announcement, the structure of the palace had reportedly changed dramatically. Communication lines were reorganized, staff were reassigned, responsibilities were transferred, and Catherine's office suddenly became far more important. That's the part viewers might miss. Royal power doesn't always look like a crown. Sometimes it looks like a person receiving a briefing. Sometimes it looks like a staff member answering a phone. Sometimes it looks like whose instruction reaches the desk first. And if the account we're examining is accurate, that was the real transfer of power, not the title, the machinery behind it. But there is still one final question. What happens to Camilla now? Because even after the alleged transfer, the story doesn't necessarily end. There is the possibility of reconciliation. There is the possibility of a quieter role. There's the possibility that Charles could attempt to rebuild trust without restoring the same authority. And then there's the bigger question surrounding Catherine. Does this alleged promotion represent a temporary solution? Or is it a sign of something much larger? Because if Catherine is increasingly trusted with greater responsibilities, while William moves closer to the center of the monarchy, the institution is naturally preparing for its future. And that future is becoming clearer. William, Catherine, a new generation, a different style of monarchy. And that may be exactly what made this alleged conflict so emotionally charged. Camilla wasn't simply losing a title. She was confronting the reality that institutions eventually move forward